Welcome again to the complete free Flutter course right here on YouTube, presented by yours truly, Ovidius Mazurum. So this is the fourth video, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about functions and darts, as well as optional arguments, default parameters, and we'll also include a little bit about the if statement. Now, of course, functions and also the if statements are absolutely integral to any type of programming. So let us jump straight in. Now, when it comes to functions, it's not going to be an entirely foreign concept because we have already worked with functions before, specifically void main. As you know, everything runs in this function, but just like we can have this main function, we can have other smaller functions as well. And what a function is a collection of code. And I can declare a function either outside of the main function or inside the main function. Both of them are correct. So to give a quick example, I could make a function, for example, say hello. I'll open and close the brackets or parentheses, and then we need a function body, which to do that you open your curly brace and close your curly brace. And of course, VS Code does that for me automatically. I just have to open them and it will close them for me. So then I can put anything I want to inside the function. In this case, I can just use a simple print statement and say hello world. And of course, add a semicolon at the end. This is just a simple function. To call it, I can go to my main function and say hello, with a semicolon at the end. So notice that the name here, as well as the brackets, is exactly the same as the function name. And if I save it and then type dot v4, because it's in a folder called v4 / vid4.dart, you can see from my main function, it's going to call say hello. And once we go to say hello, it's just going to print hello world. And you can see hello world printed down here. So that works perfectly fine. Now we can also have functions with arguments or parameters. So an argument or a parameter is anything that goes right here in between the first brackets. And this is any kind of variable which we can use inside the function. So for example, I have say hello name, and I'm going to pass in the argument or the parameter, both is fine, name. And I can say print hello $name. What this is going to do for us is, and you can see I've commented this out so we won't see the output. We can use say hello name, and then right here we can give in the parameter, the variable, and I could say Ovid. And then if I print that, notice how it changes to say hello Ovid. But I can also use anything else, hello Nikita. And now it's going to say hello Ovid from the first one, hello Nikita from the second one. You might be curious what happens if you leave it blank. And one thing I will mention is that with programming, if you're ever curious about something, just try it and see what happens. So in this case, notice it gives me an error. It says 1 positional argument expected, but 0 found. And if I try to run it, it's not going to work. Well, it is going to work, but it's just going to ignore this final one. This is not valid because it's expecting an argument. One more change we really should make to this is, just like our regular variables need a type, our passed in variables should also have a type. You can see by hovering over it, it says dynamic name because I haven't given it a type. But remember from last time, I mentioned we really should be avoiding this dynamic. If you know the type, or well, if you don't know the type, figure out the type first. And once you know it, you should definitely write it right here. In this case, name will be a string, but you can accept any other type as well. Of course, you might be wondering, what if we want something to be optional? For example, over here, this gave me an error and it was ignored. But some functions can take an argument or they can not take an argument. If I comment these out, and I comment them out with control and slash, and that will do it for me automatically. And I also mentioned we can declare the function inside the main function, so I'll show you how to do that as well. We could say hello optional, and like before, print hello name. And of course now it's giving me an error because I haven't included it yet. Notice it says undefined name because it doesn't know what this variable is. But as soon as I say string name, this warning, this error is going to go away. But currently it's not optional, it's always required. But what I can do is I can put these square brackets around this, and this makes it an optional argument. That means now I can use this function, hello optional, either without a name, or, and it would help if I could spell, or I can also include a name. Both of these will be correct. And if I run it, on the first one, notice it's going to say hello null. So what is this null? Null, I'll just write it here. Null means empty value. There's nothing there. In fact, whenever we start a variable, the first time we declare it, it's null. And in this particular case, I'm using name, but I never passed in a value for name. So as a result, it is null currently. And that's what we're seeing on this first run. But of course, if I pass in the value, that value is taken, and that works perfectly fine. Another thing you might want to do is have a default value for one of your parameters or one of your arguments. So the same way I can say hello optional and just leave it out, but then it says hello null, which isn't necessarily the best user experience. If I just comment this out, and I'll write the function down here because I think it looks better when you separate these. I can say hello default string name, and we can put, if I use the square brackets around it, I can use string name equals, and then I can write the default value. So I could write my own name, and then as before, hello name. And I'm going to copy this, so in the future I can just paste it. And by doing this, if I call it like before, say hello default, and leave it empty, what it's going to do is it's going to use the default value, the value I gave over here, which in this case is Ovidius. But on the other hand, if I want to type something in like Katya, it's going to accept that. So notice if I call it without any arguments, it's going to say hello Ovidius. But if I call it with an argument Katya, hello Katya, and it's going to ignore the default arguments that I passed in instead. However, sometimes we might not want to pass in a default value, but at the same time, we don't want to leave it as null because it might break our program. In the previous examples, it just doesn't look nice, but it still works. But if we were doing something else, for example, print square, now we can actually break the program if I leave it blank. If I say int x equals, in fact, there should be no equals, int x here, so it's a optional parameter, and then print, and I can say x times x. If I run this one and I need to call it, that would help. If I run this one now with no parameters, notice that it's going to give me an error. It said unhandled exception, no such method error, the method multiplication was called on null. So for math operations, I cannot do something like this. I cannot use null. So I have two options here. Well, a few options. I could give it a default value, but maybe it doesn't really make sense in this program. Or something we often use is an if statement. And an if statement is exactly like, well, it's just like it is in English. I can say if something, open and close curly brackets, do something. And I can either leave it like this, or I can say else, open and close curly brackets, do something else. So for example, I could take this and put it here and say if x equals null, and in fact I'll have to move this underneath, then print no number given, else print x times x. So this does exactly what you would think. If we don't pass in anything, so therefore x is null, it's just going to print no number given. But on the other hand, if we do pass in a number, it's going to print out that number squared. So if I say print square and print square with a number, you're going to see running the same thing. On the first one, it's going to say no number given instead of null, which is much nicer. On the second one, it's going to tell us 25, which was that number squared. All of the functions we've seen so far have just printed something out, and they haven't given us any value back. Most often, a function is actually used to give us some kind of value, to calculate something and then return a value to us. For example, this print square is honestly a bit strange. It's not something we would do very often, but what you might see much more often is square, and then we can again say int x, and this time I'm going to make it required. And then oftentimes we would return x by x in this case. So that return keyword just means give us back a value. And I could also write the calculations here, for example, int y equals x times x, and then instead of calculating it here, I can just return y. And you'll often see function bodies which are really long, all kinds of calculations, and then just returning it at the end. However, just like our variables can have a type, y is an int, x is an int, because here I'm returning something, my function also has a type. And notice again, when I hover over it, it says dynamic square, and we just hate that dynamic keyword. We do not like that at all. So instead, we're going to specify the type just like we would with a variable. And I'm sure you guys can guess what it is. In this case, we're going to return int y. So we're going to say int square. And this is the return type of the function. But then you might think of the other functions. Hey, print square, say hello, default, so on. That didn't return anything. So what should we say for the return function here? Because I'm sure if we hover over them, they're all going to say dynamic, and that is not what we want at all. Well, we have another keyword, which is void. This void means don't return anything. There will be no return statement. So now if I hover over print square, you'll notice it says void correctly rather than dynamic. And really, all of our functions should have said void. This is a much nicer way of doing it. By doing it this way, our program is going to be more performant than it otherwise had been by not declaring that void and leaving it as dynamic. And just as a quick aside, of course you'll notice main uses void, and you might be wondering why that is. Well, normally our void doesn't return anything. However, notice I say normally. Anybody who's quite eagle-eyed might have noticed in the very first video, I mentioned normally it's void main, but it can be int main. Well, when it's int main, the reason we do this is because we can return some kind of number, which usually represents an error code. So if you've ever seen something like when a program crashes, especially in Windows, it will say error 212, error 56, whatever. what that's done is returned that code in case something goes wrong. So it says something like, if something goes wrong, return 523, right? And then 0 is the default return value to mean everything went perfectly fine. There were no errors at all. Okay, but in Dart and Flutter, we don't usually do this. However, you will often see this in other programming languages, especially in C, Java, stuff like that. But that was just a quick side. We don't need to worry about that too much. So far we've covered functions, optional arguments, how to pass in arguments, default parameters, and of course the return type. But there is one more thing we can do, which is really important to understand about functions. You guys will remember, of course, when I tried calling a function earlier, which did not have an optional argument, but I didn't pass one in, it gave me an error. And when I did that, it said 1 positional argument expected, but 0 found. Well, the fact that they actually tell us positional arguments means there's probably a different type of arguments as well. And all of these are positional arguments because they depend on the position. If I make this longer, int add, for example, int x, int y, and then I could just say return x plus y, our x is going to be the first passed in, and our y will be the second argument passed in. And in this particular example, it won't matter, but if I do it the other way, subtract, whereas x minus y, in this case, the order does matter. So to quickly show you guys what I mean, and we can just get rid of this as well. If I use, and here we need to use a print statement, because if I run this, it doesn't print anything. It'll calculate the value, but it's not going to show it anywhere. So we might not even realize it ran. So here I'll use print sub 10 and 5 for the first one. And then I can also use let's use 5 and 10 the other way around. So we'll notice when we run this, because I used positional arguments over here, the values of x and y depend on which one I passed in first. So if we look at the bottom, I have 5 and minus 5. Even though I passed in the same arguments, they were treated quite differently based on the position. The same way I can use positional arguments, I can also use named arguments. And these named arguments are arguments that we're going to pass in by name rather than position. I can use the say hello functions in a more interesting way. I could say string build greeting from name. And by using these curly brackets here inside the regular brackets, I can pass in named arguments. And I do that the same way I did before. I'll just put the type with the name of the argument and then a second one. So now I have 2 arguments, greeting and name, and then I can, I'm gonna build an intermediate value, temp string, and then I can say if greeting not equal to null. So this right here, that means not, and I can just type that out. I have a extension which makes my comments a different color if I use exclamation mark at the beginning. So this means if greeting is not equal to null, then we can say temp string plus equals. So that's going to take the value that is already in temp string and then add something. And I can add greeting. And in fact, to do this, I should really be starting with a blank string. and then I can say else, and then give it some kind of default value. Else temp string plus equals hello. And then I can do the same thing for name. If name not equal to null, temp string plus equals name, and if it is equal to null, we can pass in some kind of default argument, for example, world. So now using this function up here, I can pass in nothing, but I can also pass in just the greeting, hola. I don't know, I said that really badly. But the great thing about named arguments, as opposed to positional arguments, if I was using positional arguments, whatever goes in first is always going to be the first argument, of course. But what if I don't want greeting and I only want name? In this case, I have to use named arguments because now Dart knows that I'm putting this Maria as my name, but greeting is going to be blank, it's going to be null. And in fact, I can even do it, I can even pass in my arguments the opposite way than I had written them originally. So I can say name is Pavel and greeting can be Privyet. We'll bring some Russian in here. And all of these will work perfectly fine. I can just run this. So none of them have a print statement, which is why nothing prints it out. In all of these examples, I'm just, in this function, I'm just building that string, but I'm not actually printing the string anywhere, which is why nothing was printed. And honestly, that's the way most of our functions will work in the real world. So if I do it again now, all of them say null. So obviously I made a mistake somewhere. So let's see if anybody can find my mistake. Okay, so the reason all of them say null is because I built this temp string, but I forgot to return it. And we're also going to see one other small error when I do this. Notice that when I run it, there's no space. It's going to say hello world, hola world, hello Maria, and so on and so forth. And if we look up here, we can see where this comes from. And notice all of it did kind of what we wanted to do, except for one small mistake. There's no space between them. And of course, this is because with programming, the computer will always do exactly what we tell it to do. We never told it to add a space, so there's no space. To fix this, we're going to have to say temp string plus equals and just add a space over them. And if we run it again, now it will say correctly hello world, hola world, hello Maria, privyet Pavel. It does everything the way we want it to do. That's pretty much all the important things to do with functions. We're going to quickly review everything before giving you your exercise. So today we learned about functions. A function, as we said, is some kind of block of code. And I should switch this back to void. It's some kind of block of code which we can use outside of the main function or inside the function to separate things out. Functions should have some kind of return type, and if we're not returning anything, we should be using the void keyword. A function can have one or more arguments or parameters, which we put here between the brackets. If we just leave it like this, it will be a positional argument. But on the other hand, if we put these curly brackets around it, it will be a named argument, where we have to say name and then have the colon and then the value. If we put these square brackets around it, that makes it an optional argument, and we can also give it a default value by saying equals and then giving it a value over there instead. And also we learned about the if statements. So if, and then some kind of expression inside brackets, and then do something, and else. But of course, we can also do an if statement without the else. Okay, so that was pretty much it for this lesson, this tutorial. But there is one exercise I'd like you guys to do, just to make sure you really understand this all the way. So I happen to have made a function which I have saved in a different file, which I named get total seconds. And if we print this out, and if I run this, we'll see exactly what it is I want you guys to build. If I pass in just the hours, it's going to give me 3,600 seconds. Giving it no input will give me 0 seconds, 1 minute, 60 seconds of course, and 1 second of course is 1 second. But if I pass in multiple arguments, it's going to give me back the total amount of seconds with all of this. So this is going to be your challenge and your exercise for next time. Make a simple function which takes hours, minutes, and seconds, or none of those, and returns the total number of seconds. Okay guys, so I look forward to seeing your solutions, and in the meantime, if you guys prefer to just wait for the solution I'll present, then I look forward to that as well. Guys, that was it for this video. Don't forget to like the video if you feel like you've learned a lot, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. That was it for today. So for myself, Avidius, I am out.